You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 483 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have more updates on how the U.S. government is responding to the coronavirus. The big news story of the day is Trump tweeting that he has instructed the Navy to shoot down Iranian ships that harass American ships. And I'm going to cover a very interesting and important poll of veterans and military families and their opinions on the war in Afghanistan. So make sure you share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor, and write the daily news roundup. Both the news roundup and the show are on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. I do 3 shows a week. Pretty much all I'm doing here is updating current events, what's going on with the empire and different conflicts around the world. Once you subscribe, if likes, ratings, reviews, thumbs up, all that kind of stuff does help to promote the show and get it out there to new people, and I really appreciate it. It's good feedback, that people are listening to the show and liking it. So if you take the time to do that, that's awesome. And then financially, you can support the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. So first story I have today is about the Space Force. 86 members of the graduating Air Force Academy class are going to become members of the Space Force and not the Air Force. And so, we're starting to fill the ranks of the Space Force. Of course, even though there was, I think until recently, only one official member, like uniformed soldier, the general who ran it, of the Space Force, but there were thousands of contractors working for the thing. It's not just like one guy in the basement office of the Pentagon somewhere. I think it's important to continue to update what the Space Force is doing. It's a new government program. This is the 6th branch of the military, and so it's going to be growing and expanding a lot right now, and there's not going to be a lot of attention paid to it because of the coronavirus. And so as they're adding members to the ranks, weapons to their arsenal, looking for new funding, that's going to have to be highlighted, even while everybody is paying so much attention to what in some cases is a much more immediate threat of coronavirus. The other immediate threat is the government's response to the coronavirus. In 3 states, including California and Alabama, prison staff are monitoring phone calls for mentions of the coronavirus. Now, I think, first of all, this is probably going to be highly ineffective. There's so many ways to refer to coronavirus, COVID, CV19. I've heard so many different, ways to describe it, the virus, what's going on right now, and it's such an important topic. So many people are getting it. And so, if you're talking to somebody, probably what you want to know is, does any of my family have COVID? How's grandma doing? Who's social distancing? That kind of stuff. And I'm sure people who have family members in prisons, watch, read the news sources like the Intercept that actually do take the time to cover what's going on in U.S. prisons and understand that the coronavirus problem there is fairly significant. And so, they're probably concerned in asking their relatives, hey, do you have it? Do you know anybody who has it? And they're probably sweeping up so much data, as what often happens with these surveillance programs, that they're not going to produce any useful results. Now, if the prison officials are able to do anything with this data, my guess is that they're going to use it as retribution for anybody who's, they're calling relatives or journalists and saying like, hey, they're not giving us masks. The problem in here is really bad. We got to get the word out that we need, more protection equipment. We're locked up in a cell with 4 other guys. 2 of them are hacking. They're not getting people out of here. This is a real problem. And, those type of people may be punished how people are punished in the prison system when they try to speak out, whether it's, limiting what little, freedoms they're still allowed, like calling relatives or, sending, receiving letters, or, put in solitary confinement or something like that. The USS Comfort, which is one of those 2 gigantic hospital ships that were deployed to, I believe, LA, and then this one in New York City, in order to combat the coronavirus and to help, because apparently the hospitals were going to be overwhelmed, is now actually leaving the port after treating only 176 people. And so this kind of struck me as something that is clearly a misdeployment of resources in the time of coronavirus. And so I thought it would maybe prompt a chance to talk about like the threat inflation going on and why even when something like coronavirus, there's a risk. So I remember it was either in late February, early March, I read a tweet that, when you first read it, sounds kind of insightful. And basically what this person is saying is that, you have to, if you're willing to like do everything you need to do to fight the coronavirus, and if it's as bad as we think it is, we have to look like we overreacted. And that, that's kind of like the moral position to take, is that, you have to overreact to something like this. Now, the problem is that there's all kinds of unintended consequences from overreacting. And so, you had Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, doing these daily press briefings saying how, terrible the situation was in New York. And not to say that the situation in New York wasn't bad. Thousands of people died with, coronavirus being the main cause of death. But at the same time, he's saying we need tens of thousands of more ventilators, all these new hospital beds. And it turns out that they really didn't need, they never hit the maximum capacity for hospital beds. It looks like, the thing is peaked again. The Navy ship is leaving. And so now we've poured all these extra resources into New York City when it could have been going elsewhere. And so, it's just such a clear example of, you can over Trump up, this crisis. Now, what's going to be a lot harder to explain to people is that because we've seen all these supply chain shortages, and, most Americans really don't notice because other than toilet paper, and this is more a meme, most of the time when you go to the store, things are there. Even, there's limits on eggs and stuff like that right now, but every time I go, you're able to get 2 dozen. And so I assume that if anybody really needed a lot of eggs, you just had to go to the store a few extra times. But, there's always some on the shelf. So I don't think we necessarily understand what the implications are, but people are talking about now that, consequences, months down the road now with all the supply chain disruptions, and this thing didn't get shipped for, 3 months. And so whatever plant was supposed to open up couldn't open up in time, and that delayed this and that. And they're saying that could lead to, now millions of additional people around the world going hungry and starving because of the actions that we've taken here. And so, in the U.S., we have the world reserve currency, which means our Federal Reserve gets to print a ton of money to make Americans feel okay during this time. But the disruptions to the world economy are going to be absolutely huge. And so it's not just like you have a blank ticket to overreact to how you respond to the coronavirus. There has to be some kind of measured response and understanding that, there are unintended consequences. All right, next up, I have this poll of, again, veterans and U.S. Military families about their feelings on the war in Afghanistan. Get this, 73%, nearly 3/4 of veterans believe that we should come home. And then I believe that number is 68% among military families. These are huge numbers. Now, this is important because at this point, what the hell are we doing in Afghanistan? And so much of the narrative, is we can't quit the fight because we've invested so much, money and blood into it. Well, the people who are investing the blood, the military families and the veteran are saying that it's not worth fighting anymore. And so, I think they kind of understand that just because, 10 years ago, unfortunately, the Taliban killed a U.S. soldier in an insider attack in Kandahar doesn't mean that you deploy, a bunch more young men there where, some of them are also going to die. It's not worth it anymore. The other thing is, these are the people, the veterans specifically, who have the most experience, like on the ground in Afghanistan, what's going on, the veterans of that war. And obviously they don't believe in the mission and that it's worth fighting, and they don't see a way to win it. And so if they're saying we got to stop fighting it, I don't know, that seems like just about the clearest thing other than reading Fool's Errand, the great Scott Horton's book, to really prove this point. All right, so on Israel here, there's a couple interesting things going on with annexation. On the last show, I mentioned this unity deal signed between Netanyahu and Bernie Gantz. The two main rivaled political factions, are formerly rivaled political factions in Israel. And part of that deal opens up a vote on annexation for portions of the West Bank starting July 1st. In the past on the show, I've talked in detail about how annexing, the parts of the West Bank that have settler colonies in them and are controlled by the Israeli military will essentially make it impossible to ever see the West Bank as like a continuous Palestinian statelet of any kind ever again, and is going to be a real blow for the Palestinians living in the West Bank. And so we're starting to see fallout from that. Secretary of State Pompeo said that if the Israelis want to do that, that's their decision. That's a green light from the Americans. And then this had the effect of the Palestinian political leader, Abbas, who has well overstated his welcome as a Palestinian leader, and it's in part because of Israel's occupation of Palestine that those people really can't have an election to pick a new political leader. But he says that he will break all ties with Israel and the U.S. if they move forward with annexing. So again, we're going to see a lot of developments between now and July on what's going on here, where all the different maps being drawn up, the proposals, stuff like that. And now a lot of it is going to get, press attention as the coronavirus thing continues to go on, but it's going to be so important to follow this and see what the U.S. is green lighting and not, and just how screwed the Palestinians are going to be on this deal. All right, so the big story here, of course, is Trump's tweet about shooting down. I just love that he said shooting down. Part of me, I don't want to just sit here and mock Trump for being stupid, because what he's doing is so dangerous. And I always had this suspicion that when he wants to do something really particularly dangerous, he says it in a really stupid way. That way, the just kind of typical left-wing media that's kind of low-brow, like Rachel Maddow and Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski and Anderson Cooper, are just going to talk about how, dummy Trump is sitting there tweeting, and how dangerous is it that he's tweeting about, what he's ordering the Navy to do, and how he said shoot down rather than sink. But what I want to highlight here is just how destructive this is. And I'm glad that Trump said it in such a stupid way that everybody paid attention and at least noticed it in a time of coronavirus. And I'm glad that he tweeted it and didn't just kind of order the Navy to do it. So there would be a public discussion. Now, before we get into this too much, I think it's worth pointing out that the Navy has come out and said that they interpret this as a warning to Iran, but they are not changing the way they operate in the Persian Gulf. And so I assume that means that, they're saying they're not going to sink an Iranian ship for doing something, quote unquote, harassing a U.S. warship. So on Monday's episode with Will Porter, we talked about in detail that this incident, that this kind of all evolved from, where a U.S. warship was operating just outside of Iranian waters. And so some Iranian speedboats came in, kind of drove circles around the U.S. warship. Again, these weren't large speedboats, and it didn't seem like anything that was particularly provocative or concerning. It's not like the Americans were in danger and the Iranians weren't firing. And in fact, this is a situation where the size of the Iranian speedboats, if there's any kind of collision, I think it would do pretty minimal damage to U.S. ship. So, as I kind of mentioned on the show with Will, unless you're looking at this from a very soda straw view, where, you're just looking at the Iranian ship circling around the American ship, this is in no way threatening to the United States. This is in the Persian Gulf. These ships have no ability, to cross any kind of really blue water ocean and come interfere with any kind of commerce in America or anything off of American shores. There's absolutely no threat to the U.S. state, itself. That what is the United States of America? It's just only when we put our warships right off the coast of other countries that we have an economic war going on against that our ships get harassed. Now, again, I think with the Navy statement, my feeling is here that if this happens again tomorrow, the U.S. doesn't launch a missile at one of these Iranian boats, and we have some, larger conflict going on. But that is what Trump ordered, and should that happen, it's the kind of thing that could very quickly devolve into a shooting war with Iran, something that the U.S. and Iran doesn't need right now. We know from the Theodore Roosevelt, from the French Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, that the coronavirus will absolutely plague and run through these ships like crazy. And it's extremely dangerous to the crew. And it must be a huge tactical disadvantage to have no ability to have your, military social distance, because you're trying to fight a war halfway across the world for absolutely no reason. So you had to, float all of your sailors, in these large, floating runways to carry out the warfare. But the problem is this is just another step towards conflict between the U.S. and Iran. I already mentioned the economic war, the proxy stuff that's going on in Iraq, not to mention that, very recently you had another Israeli drone attack, and this time in Palmyra, Syria, killing 9 military personnel in the, General Assad, Iran, Hezbollah, axis that's fighting there. They say that at least 6 of those soldiers who died were not Syrians, suggested to be Hezbollah. So again, the U.S. and Iran tensions play out across the Middle East through various actors on both sides here. Sometimes it's Israel, sometimes it's Hezbollah, sometimes it's Assad, all the same. These are all tensions and places a flashpoint. And so we don't need to be taking in that direction because here's another flashpoint actually. The Iranians launched the IRGC, put their first military satellite into orbit. Now, the problem with this isn't that Iran put a military satellite into orbit, or maybe that's, tactically the problem, or, something that's going on behind the scenes. But they say that basically launching these satellites into orbit is Iran's way of testing ICBMs to, deliver a nuclear bomb they don't have to the American homeland. Now, as absurd as it is that Iran is working on an ICBM program at this time when they very clearly don't have any kind of nuclear weapons program going on. So, that missile would be absolutely useless. I mean, delivering a non-nuclear payload to the U.S. homeland would just get Iran nuked itself. There's no way they would follow that path. And then also, there's the technical argument. Just no country has ever developed an ICBM program out of a space program. I believe the only country that developed an ICBM after they developed a satellite or put a satellite into orbit was North Korea, and they use completely different types of rockets. It's a completely different situation where with the payload and kind of the trajectory of the flight. So you need different kinds of engines and fuel cycles. I'm not a rocket scientist myself, but you can read rocket scientists who go on and explain why, only hats like Mike Pompeo really try to push this argument that scientifically doesn't make any sense. Although, maybe it sounds good, rockets are rockets to some people who really don't get it, that you're not going to make an ICBM out of a space rocket. And then tactically, Iran's not doing that. However, the U.S. says this violates UN authorizations or different Security Council agreements that are supposed to invoke more sanctions on Iran. Something that Iran doesn't need at this time. They're fighting a coronavirus outbreak. They're fighting the economic war against the United States. Oil prices have fallen through the floor, like literally. And so, further sanctions is just going to further the suffering of the Iranian. All right. And then the last story I have for the week is a U.S. military convoy was chased out of a village in Syria. This is actually the second time this has happened. And, it's just important to highlight that this is still going on. There's no reason for the U.S. to be in Syria at this point. It's clear that Assad has won that civil war. We're really not even that close with our Kurdish, friends in Syria anymore. At this point, we're quote unquote staying for the oil that's absolutely worthless. And, it seems like as good a time as any to use coronavirus or whatever the hell excuse Trump needs to just bring U.S. troops home. All right, everybody, hope you enjoyed the show. Share it. Find it online at the Libertarian Institute, or you find me on social media. Foreign Policy Focus is the name of the Facebook group. On Twitter at KYAAALE, and patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.